Hello and welcome to our conversation, Russia's activities in Africa. So Russia builds its presence in some African countries by relying on ties going all the way back to the Soviet era. It has been boasting its diplomatic links in the region, seeking deals and security relationships. And the COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy has been one of the key elements to it. So Russia, to quote the Stanford Internet Observatory, Russia's Facebook networks have been targeting the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Sudan, and included news pages and websites and pages purporting to belong to political parties as well as individual politicians. The part of the operation was analyzed included 73 Facebook pages, approximately 1.72 million accounts liked the Facebook pages. The page managers were quite active with 9,000 posts in October 2019 alone. That is the outline of the MO. But today, let us dive into the who, the why, and given that this is a NATO Stratcom center after all, what does that mean and what can the US, NATO, and the EU do about it? Now, let me introduce our speakers, our distinguished guests for today. We have Paul Stronski, Senior Fellow in Carnegie Endowment Russia and Eurasia Program. Hello, Paul. Also with us today, we have Alex Vines, who is the Director of the Africa Program at Chatham House. Hello, Dr. Vines. Hello, Alex. Great seeing you. So my name is Bērziņa-Čerenkova. I'm head of the Riga Stradins University Political Science PhD program and a China scholar, and I will be your moderator today. Now, Paul, please start us off by presenting your outline for today.
I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to go through very quickly to give a broad outline. So if you just let me share that screen real quick. Why is this not working? Sorry about that. Great. Well, thank you very much again for the opportunity, and I really look forward to this conversation. I just wanted to sort of launch this discussion by highlighting sort of Russia's overall strategy for the region, where it fits within its global foreign policy, and also its information operations and how that fits into all of this as well. Russia today looks at Africa as a place to project power. It's a place to develop economic ties for its key industries. This is particularly important after sanctions by the European Union and the United States have sort of denied access to European and American markets. And they also seek African relations with African leaders to help realize its vision of a multipolar world. For Russia, its Africa outreach is relatively low cost. A lot of this is done by commercial arms of the Russian state. A lot of the information operations is done by organizations affiliated with Prigozhin, the person, Putin's chef, the guy who runs the Wagner organization. The Kremlin and the MFA and others, they certainly provide some diplomatic heft. A lot of delegations go back and forth, of course, not in the COVID era, but we are seeing that happen as well. Before then. And we see a lot of information operations, which all suggest that Russia is more active than it actually is on the African continent. But that's basically what they want to convey, because in many ways, Russia is really struggling to shore up its economic and political presence on the continent. Russia is certainly looking to opportunities and missteps by the United States and Europe, and there have been a lot of them in the last few years. And Russia, through its propaganda and through its cultivation of elites, is really trying to tarnish the image of the West. It sort of highlights the fact that this notion that it believes that the West is the promoter of instability. It's responsible for color revolutions, for the Arab Spring, the problems in Libya, the problems in Mali. It highlights the difficulties that the West have had in responding to crises, whether that is solving Libya whether it's really reducing the violence in the Central African Republic, the Sahel, Madagascar. It tried to step in there as well a year ago. Russia claims in its public diplomacy and some of its outreach of some of its private groups that the West is imposing its values, its liberal values on the continent, and it's really working to starting to cultivate conservative societies and values oriented organizations. It certainly plays on anti-colonial resentments and sentiments in the region. And it also highlights the difficulties that the West has had in managing the COVID response, whether that was a year ago. It highlights either the alleged ineffectiveness of some Western vaccines. Also makes a lot of claims about how the West is hoarding its vaccines and that they don't work. And Russia is now coming to the rescue. There's a little bit of interest in that. When I last fall, I did a lot of research on what actually Russia had done for Africa vis-a-vis COVID, and it really didn't do a whole lot. They didn't send the same sorts of high-profile mask and ventilator diplomacy like they did to New York. That was largely, again, to highlight sort of the dysfunction of the U.S.'s response. And today, it is talking about its vaccine diplomacy, but Russia is having much of that is being done on a commercial level, not working through COVAX, and Russia itself is having difficulty supplying the vaccine to its own population. So how is it going to do this to the broader globe at large? Russia is attractive to many African leaders, particularly the leaders. It doesn't ask any questions on human rights. Russian companies are not bound by any sort of anti-corruption practices. Russia is not China. It doesn't have the same amount of deep pockets. But there's limited knowledge and interest in Russian culture in Africa. This was not the case, 30 years ago when there was a lot of exchanges between the Soviet Union and Africa, but it is especially the case today among the younger generations. As I said, the USSR was influential in Africa. It had a whole bunch of soft power education programs, humanitarian efforts. It supported the anti-colonialization movements, but it largely disengaged from the continent really until the last couple of years. And if you look at Russia's strategic documents, you will see Africa is not prominently figured in them. Really until 2014, they only were focused in on South Africa and the BRICS. They sort of saw South Africa and some African nations, the African Union and organization too, as an ally in sort of trying to create a multipolar world and sort of weaken the influence of the West in the international system. But even today, I would argue that Africa is not a prime area of strategic importance to Russia, and there's actually very little coverage in the Russian media of Africa itself. I think people are very much looking more towards what's going on in their immediate neighborhood and home as well. Russia does have its economic tools, but it has the few economic tools it has around the world. It's energy and arms. It cannot compete with other US or European technologies. It does not compete with Western assistance. As I said, it's given very little to COVAX. It cannot compete with Chinese financing. The Russians like to tout how they've given $20 billion in debt relief in the post-Soviet era. That doesn't compare to that's a drop in the bucket compared to what you see from coming from China, which is $143 billion in just commercial loans alone. And the Sputnik vaccine, it's certainly out there, but whether or not they'll be able to translate that into a real economic tool and a political tool is quite unclear to me right now. Russia is struggling. It has some highly ambitious projects. Rosatom seems to be everywhere on the continent, but if you just look at its books, the order books, it's really unrealistic. They're not going to be able to build everything that they've pledged to build, and there's only one real project on the continent. It's in Egypt that has received any sort of construction permit already. Trade turnover is growing. But it's highly concentrated actually on North Africa and highly concentrated on arms. It really struggles, Russia does, when it goes to sub-Saharan Africa. Russia also has deep inroads in very few other places. It's Sudan, Zimbabwe, and the Central African Republic. Those are places where the West, has longstanding difficulties both with the regimes, and there's not a whole lot of leverage that the West has. High reputational risks also for Western companies to be involved in all of those places. There are growing security ties. There's a lot of intel sharing agreements and memorandums of understanding. They're trying to sort of cultivate Soviet-era linkages and sort of find all those Soviet-trained intel officers that are still in intel agencies across the continent. They try to do this with politicians as well. They see a keen importance of keeping African countries buying Russian arms, particularly since there's a more competitive global arms market today. And there's also an increased use of private military corporations such as Wagner. And I would say that is largely because the Russian public doesn't want to know and is not being told about Russia's exploits on the continent, particularly its military exploits. So a lot of it is being done through Russian PMCs. It's a deniable tool, deniable both to the West and deniable both to the Russian population. It's relatively cheap. Wagner in Central African Republic, it has gained lucrative stakes in oil and minerals and gas in return for its services. So there's not a whole lot of funding coming out of the Russian government for that. And Wagner is the largest and most active Russian PMC in Africa, but there's others also there. It has been moving into political consulting. Wagner-associated firms run by Prigozhin are engaging in information operations, many of which are the ones that in the Stanford research project. And it's been active in multiple hotspots in the region. I'm just going to quickly finish up. Russia has political tools too that it tries to cultivate. It's a defender of authoritarianism. It does all of this new political and public opinion advising and polling. It's trying to reactivate Soviet-era linkages and has robust senior-level engagement with high-level diplomacy. A large number of senior officials and members of the Duma go to Africa. Its Africa summit was sort of a big one. It was high profile, but there hasn't been a whole lot of follow through. COVID kind of interrupted it, and we'll see where it goes for the next. Here's just a few photos of some of the big meetings of the last decade. And in conclusion, I would just sort of argue, Russia doesn't have a great hand to play, but it plays it extremely well in Africa. The West has a better story to tell, in my sense, as far as what we do, as far as our economic footprint and our engagement, but I'm not sure we're always telling that story. And COVID, our difficulties in responding to the COVID pandemic certainly provide a lot of new avenues for Russian disinformation. I think, we talk a lot about sort of Russia and Chinese influence there, but I think if we focus on some of the basics, good governance, public diplomacy, human security, I think that's, a lot of the places where we can actually make a difference and really try to sort of regain some footing across the continent. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Paul, and indeed some key takeaways. Not as active as wants to convey. Russia is elite-oriented and not as many resources as China, and yet it plays a bad hand quite well. Now, just a quick follow-up question to you to bring this back, and rather to concentrate this into the realm of strategic communications. You have written in your previous research, quote, wide-ranging travels of Russian political consultants and disinformation specialists to Africa, right? So, and at the end of 2020, indeed, the Russian MFA confirmed that it had been sending instructors and military instructors, and Zakharov gave this very open interview to Al Jazeera also, right, speaking and showing this. Now, my question, and also we know that there are also political consultants. So my question to you here is, we remember the political consultation in Zimbabwe with Emerson Mnangagwa in 2017, right? How are they consulting? Is this just electoral assistance and, for a success fee in return for resources? Or is it really coupled with disinformation and all these murky agendas that we call disinformation and misinformation? I mean, you mentioned Madagascar 2019. That was quite a fail, I believe, for the Russian consultants. And internet trolls are reported to have been deployed. So could you please comment on these Russian electoral assistance cases in Africa?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Certainly. I mean, I think these are not necessarily successful operations. I think a lot of these start off as commercial operations. And if you look at some of the people who've been deployed, they are people who have experience in local politics somewhere in Russia and in fixing local elections somewhere in Russia. Very often, when they've entered in as political consultants, they have bet on the wrong candidate. And they've switched switched candidates when they see somebody has a little bit of a better chance of political success. But these people are not necessarily folks that have a deep understanding of African context, African politics, and sort of how and those shifts. But I do think there's a lot of freewheeling and free dealing among these. A lot of these operators, and Prigozhin is one of them. Take initiative of their own, and they hope that it will eventually pay off by building some sort of influence in the countries and that they're targeting. So they certainly will pick, and they'll try to help a candidate. And then hope that candidate or that leader will remain in power and then they'll be able to have some influence later on. So some of these fail miserably, and then some of them are a little bit more successful. And in the places where they fail, and this is why I think we really need to sort of focus in on sort of good governance, journalism, investigative journalism, particularly in the African context, because a lot of these have been exposed by Africans themselves. And I think that's a very effective way. We can sit here in the United States or in Europe and talk about all the nefarious things Russia might be doing in Africa. But when Africans are talking about that, I think it has a lot more weight than when we talk about it. And I think that's something that we can really push and help that sector in places where investigative journalism is quite active, would be quite helpful for our cause.
Thank you very much, and just want to inform that we're very much looking forward to feedback and comments and questions also coming from the affected regions. So our colleagues in Africa, we're very much looking forward to receiving your comments here online. Now, thank you. Alex, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to build on what Paul has presented. So I've also got a few slides, so just bear with me. In fact, I can't share my screen. Can somebody just allow me to do that? So
This always happens, but I'm sure you will bear with us, and we will hear what Alex has to say.
I just unshared my screen, so you should be able to share it now.
I'm having
All right, then,
problems.
while this is happening, Paul, let me grab you again, and I want to ask you, you talked about Prigozhin, right? You talked about him and his personality. So my question to you is this activity personality-based? So on one hand, we know that some of the Western analysts are very careful with making that statement. They say these operations are likely to be operating at least in part at the behest of a state actor. But the centrality was just, is this an ironclad strategy pillar or not? It's quite hard. So could you please comment on how much do personalities play here? What kind of a role do they play?
Well, I think personalities certainly do play a lot, and Prigozhin is a very powerful person who's close to Putin, and I think what he's doing, if they really wanted to stop it, Putin himself could probably stop it. Prigozhin is not a very well loved person among the Russian elite. There's a lot of infighting. There are people in the Russian MFA. And the Russian MOD who are often cleaning up his messes. And so there are certain people and certain political and bureaucratic entities that certainly would like sort of Prigozhin to sort of reduce and lose some of his power. And we've certainly seen, Prigozhin get routed in Mozambique. We've seen them get routed most recently in Libya. So they're not always fully successful in what they do, but he's a pretty powerful. Wagner is pretty powerful, and it is able to leverage elements of the Russian state, and it's tied to elements of the Russian state. So, I mean, I think we see very much sometimes some of the infighting within the Russian state playing out, in some of Prigozhin's activities, where he tries to go it alone.
Thank you. And I believe we're good. And
Great.
Back to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as I said, I'll just build on what Paul excellently summarized about Russia-Africa relations. And the first point just is to remind everybody what Paul had said, that the Soviet involvement in Africa was very deep, very multidimensional, both in terms of hard power and soft power. But the Russian engagement today doesn't overlap necessarily with Soviet involvement in Africa. If you look at this old map on Soviet involvement, you will see that the Central African Republic was a place that the USSR was not heavily engaged in. And as you've heard from Paul, it is a country that the Russian Federation is deeply engaged with now in a multifaceted manner. Russia feels that it had neglected Africa since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there is a process of catch-up. And Paul mentioned the kind of watershed after 2014, and the Sochi summit in 2019 was quite significant, with 43 heads of state or government attending Sochi. The Russian government is planning a second summit next year. So we'll see how it develops, but this slide here shows you that we are in a plethora of international summits. The latest was actually the United Kingdom having its UK Africa Investment Summit in 2020. But next year could be a very busy year for summits. Not only will we have a second Russia-Africa summit, but you may have a host of delayed summits that were meant to be this year. So the India one, even possibly still the European Union, Africa Union one, are just a couple, and the Chinese FOCAC that's meant to be later this year in Dakar may well be next year too, all because of COVID. So the calendar could be very, very full, of which Russia will just be one of many. Now, Russia is re-expanding its diplomatic network within Africa. This is a slightly old slide from The Economist, but there were in 2016 40 Russian diplomatic missions. In fact, that's increased slightly. There is one now in Niamey and in Niger, for example. So the Russians have a fairly comprehensive diplomatic network. Some of them legacies of the Soviet period. So, for example, a large diplomatic building in Victoria, the capital of the Seychelles, which reflects Soviet history with Africa, but also kind of new missions. And there is re-engagement and rebuilding of diplomatic networks within Africa, as many other countries are doing. So Russia is not exceptional on that. One thing in terms of Africa, and relevant for this discussion, is to remember that the majority of African countries tend to vote in a similar pattern to China and Russia. So this slide shows just voting patterns under the Obama administration, but it is a reminder that instinctively many countries in Africa, many states are non-aligned and often more sympathetic to a Russian or Chinese position than a Western one. And so this does mean that African elites and their behavior on the international stage is kind of synced up to kind of Russian objectives at particular moments of time. Paul's mentioned this. It's just a reminder that arms and energy are really important for Russia, and particularly the defense relationships. Whereas there are only probably deep trade relationships with 8 African countries, there are defense relationships with 32. So this is quite a significant Russian offer, and it continues to be so. Although, as you'll see on the slide, the pie chart, the majority tends to be in North Africa. So North Africa, rather than sub-Saharan Africa, is really the major beneficiary of that relationship. And again, it is there are other facets to the Russian relationship moving forward. Certainly nuclear is one that the Russians are looking to develop. It's been very engaged in Egypt, but it remains a key objective of Russia for the relationship with South Africa, for example. And that will continue to be so. And then the other newer development is, and again, we've heard about this already from Paul, is the group Wagner, but also other security military consulting organizations like Sewa Security that's in the Central African Republic. And so Wagner, having learnt its skills through Ukraine and Syria, has tried to expand its model with some areas where it's made some success. Central African Republic, I think, would be one of them, and other places that it has been unsuccessful, like Paul mentioned, Mozambique is a good example, maybe not too successful in Libya either, or in Madagascar. The Central African Republic, I think, is an important example of Russian experimentation. Since the Russians went in 2017, that influence has grown considerably and became even more visible and prominent even at the end of last year with the insecurity around the elections in Central African Republic and the deployment of 300 extra military instructors. So Wagner and various other Russian activities are deep in Central African Republic, and it is an experiment to see how Russia can provide an alternative in terms of providing security, but also investments in an African country that, to be honest, only the former colonial power, France, had any interest in. And so this is an interesting example to see how it develops. The thinking in places like Paris is that the Russians will have overextended themselves and that eventually they will tire of the investments because they won't get good returns and they will withdraw. We'll see. But at the moment, it looks like the Russians are consolidating further their partnerships in Central African Republic. And that's probably going to be the theme of this year for Central African Republic. Other places, the Russians have had significant setbacks. Sudan, with the collapse of and departure of Mr. al-Bashir, is a good example of that, where I think the Russian Federation had become very closely attached to one particular long-standing leader, and was very significantly destabilized in terms of when he lost power and his regime collapsed. Having said that, Sudan has realized that it's in its interest to have multipolarity and therefore improve relations with the West, but certainly not deteriorate it too much with Russia, for example, that has been a long-standing partner of Sudan. And hence, I'll come to a slide in a moment, but we find that Sudan has provided, for example, facilities now in Port Sudan for a naval base. That's a significant departure and a gain for Russia. Other places, as we've already heard, like Mozambique, the Russian relationship is mixed. Wagner did not succeed in late 2019 in its operations and withdrew from the country in early 2020. There might be a very residual presence of Wagner, but that's just protecting elite commercial interests, nothing more. Now, I was in Mozambique in 2019 for the October elections there, and Russia was active. I saw it as an election observer. I was part of the Commonwealth Observer Group. But for example, a shadowy Russian entity provided opinion polls, which is illegal under Mozambican electoral law. Eventually, ourselves, but also Mozambican civil society, drew attention to this. The party of government, various people had been tweeting the polls that were always favorable to the party of government, Frelimo, and eventually they were kind of taken offline. It just goes to show the sorts of meddling that you do get in electoral cycles. Another was that a monitoring group that says it's is part of Russian civil society deployed, called Afrik, with 62 observers, many more than the 5 that I was with, and produced a very bland but fairly congratulatory electoral report saying everything was just great, more or less. And none of us in the other observer groups really understood what they were doing. And so again, you can see here other ways that Russia is trying to influence elections, including providing competition of electoral reporting by international observer groups. And again, Madagascar is an example also where you had significant amateurism by Russian electoral consultants that went in to try and choose various presidential candidates. But there's a good BBC expose of what actually occurred, and it was very, very ineffective. One of these gentlemen then moved on to Libya and has found himself incarcerated in Libya for providing, inverted commas, electoral services there, but probably doing something else. So Russia has made some gains, and I'm going to finish my presentation shortly. A very significant one is the permission to open a naval facility for 4 warships in Port Sudan. So again, this just goes to show that Russia is seen as a country where states like Sudan want to diversify their relationships in a multipolar world, but Russia is part of that equation. So better relations with the West, but certainly not deteriorated relations with Russia. The point is that a country like Mozambique or Sudan does not want to be pigeonholed into one particular position. And I'm not going to really talk about Sputnik, but there has been a lot of publicity about how Russia is more effective in vaccine rollout, including in Africa, than other countries. This is very much a propaganda issue, I think. And as Paul said, that much of the Sputnik rollout is on a commercial basis. It is actually more expensive than AstraZeneca and going through COVAX. And then there are donations of vaccines politically. So COVAX has been donated, for example, to Guinea, and the president of Guinea got an inoculation. But also the mining firm Alrosa has donated to places that it's very interested in, so Angola and Zimbabwe, for example. So finally, what are my conclusions? Well, my conclusions are that Russia is not the Soviet Union, but Russia has planned its re-engagement for some years. The Sochi summit was the official start, and there's a second summit next year. A lot of this is a response to the EU and US sanctions and votes at the UN General Assembly and Security Council to go and to get support there. But another key driver is that Russian strategists have realized that they have really, they need to expand the Russian economy. And it's very limited what the options are. So if you look at Russian strategy documents, they talk about, and I quote here from one of them, "The Africa continent remains the last available space for Russian economic expansion." So Africa is seen as a market for Russian technical goods, obtaining loans and offering, and this again I quote from this strategy document, "a very attractive third version of civilization, fundamentally and for the better from both the American West, including its European counterpoint, and from China." So basically Russia is also has some ambitions to provide a third way, which is about alternatives that are not the West and are not China. And so that's where there is ambition, I think, of moving beyond the niches of defense and energy that Paul talked about. There is one final point that I want to make. This slide speaks for itself, that Russian ambition may well go beyond the Sudans, Libyas, and Zimbabwe's to look at focus on other countries like Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I do see the Central African Republic as an example of experimentation. Finally, Russia is also looking at how to use its satellites to create a global internet network in competition to, for example, the UK's OneWeb or the American Starlink. And so providing satellites and in partnership is part of that. AngoSat for Angola is one example. And there's, I think, a longer term game here, which is that there is an ambition to promote a Russian cryptocurrency. So to try and encourage African economies to exit the dollar financial system and the economic influence of the West. So these are much broader ambitions when you start to look at the Russian ambitions through strategy documents. The problem is, and this goes back to Paul's point, Russia doesn't have the deep pockets of China. It doesn't have the expertise. So many of these ambitions may remain on paper rather than being fully realized. Thank you very much.
And excellent. You demonstrated, how Russia meddles in electoral cycles, and also you pointed out that I think is an extremely important point that also Paul had made: the vigilance of the local civil societies as a cornerstone of us getting this information. So I'm going to also try to shift the focus, or kind of just zoom in on Stratcom here. And you mentioned Facebook, you had screenshots. My question to you is, what really is the role of social media in these African countries? Because my colleagues, for example, in Madagascar have pointed out that actually the social media and internet coverage basically is under 10% of population. Then we here have a report by Media Landscapes from our colleagues in Central African Republic, and it basically says that the primary source of information since the 60s has been the radio. And when it comes to online media, it's not just about the accessibility, it's also about the fact, and I quote, that Central Africans are considerably suspicious of the reliability of the information these social media circulate despite their growing interest. So there's a lot of critical thinking here. How much does this strategy, meddling through Facebook, how much does it pay off for the Russians, I mean?
Is that a question to me?
Absolutely, Alex, that's a question to you. Paul got his 2 questions, and now it's your turn.
Okay, all right. So it depends on how connected particular societies are to the digital virtual world. And so, for example, I don't think that any of the social media meddling in Mozambique had any effect at all, because it's basically still a very rural society there. Now, in 10 years' time, it'll be very different. So it was more about experimentation. But if you go to a country like Kenya or Ghana, or Nigeria, you will have a very different result. And that is about seeding doubt. It is about encouraging fake news. It is about building up trust in alternative sources of information. And you can see that even media outlets like Sputnik and Russia Today are trying to make more inroads into Africa, less successfully, I think, than they have done in Central and South America, where they have made some significant progress. But you can see what can be achieved. Certainly the Chinese have made real inroads into the media market in Africa, for example. So they suggest to me there is market niche for Russia. And it may have learnt from South and Central America of how it might be able to do that. In the Central African Republic, there has been a social media battle between the French investing in social media and the Russians in social media, trying to undermine each other. So my conclusion is this leaves many Central African rather confused on what to believe if they're following this, because they are different narratives that are in competition with each other. And this brings, I think, it highlights the dangers of what is occurring. The other thing that is happening in Africa is that we are seeing troll factories that are funded and supported by Russia, located in Africa, but actually not aimed at Africa. So, for example, in the run-up to the US elections, we had troll factories in Ghana that were not about Ghana in any way. They were just cheap locations to operate from, but were aimed at influencing the elections in the United States. So Africa is becoming a platform for Russian information warfare ambitions that aren't about Africa itself, but as a platform to then launch them. So not just from Russian territory itself.
Thank you for mentioning France. Indeed, after France was benched by Facebook for coordinated and inauthentic behavior, it is indeed, in my opinion, a new era where democracies have started, to try to beat authoritarian regimes at their own game, and kind of using these tactics. And it's a very interesting topic. I think we can also go back to it. But my second question to you has something to do with your writing, and you cautiously advocate in some of your research that actually the EU needs to find find ways to engage with the Russian Federation. And you're talking about the European Union, African Union Summit of 21, which is, well, we'll see how that goes. That's but you're saying that there are these issues, right? That security, immigration, climate change, and that we need to find some common ground with the Russians. Now, how can the EU coordinate or cooperate with Russia in Africa?
Well, I do think that there needs to be areas where there can be cooperation and collaboration, but in what I wrote, I was very clear that Russia needs to be called out when it's involved in nefarious, opaque activities or trying to destabilize things. So one area I do think that the EU and NATO countries could work with Russia is on education, for example, higher education, medicine, those sorts of things. Provide quality appraisal, some of the partnerships. I think that's an opportunity. I think that there are some signs at times of where there can be cooperation in complex security situations, such as in the Sahel. So although it can be a difficult relationship, particularly between Paris and Moscow on some of these issues, there are opportunities for at least information sharing and collaboration against common threats. And so I think that's also an opportunity. In the end, there are going to be areas that are of much more serious competition. The European Eastern partnerships, the frontiers with Russia, the issues of Crimea and Ukraine. And there won't be possibilities for cooperation. Whereas in Africa, I think there will be room for really collaborating in certain ring-fenced issues. There might be even some defense things like anti-piracy, anti-armed robbery at sea that Russia and EU and other countries can work on in a limited way. So we need to work out define areas of cooperation as well as areas that there are strategic competition and indeed rivalry.
The world is never simple. Thank you. Now I have let's turn to our audience, and we have some questions. And Paul, I will ask you this, and that's a very important question. Given Russia's track record with racism, is that an Achilles heel of sorts for Russian involvement in Africa?
That's a good question, and it's a difficult question to really, to answer. I think there is not a whole lot of understanding of Russia into Africa today, particularly among the second generation. And there really isn't a whole lot of understanding of Africa in Russia, again, with people under about the age of 55. They weren't really investing in African studies. And Russian nationalists very often blame the Soviet Union's collapse on Russia's large footprint around the world, specifically focusing in on Africa. So there's a little bit of resentment about sort of Soviet Union's past on the continent. We see Russia is trying to cultivate a new generation of African elites, trying to entice people to come to Russia for higher education. But the plight of many of those people when they get to Russia is really not very pleasant because of the high levels of racism. So this is certainly a problem for Russia. I think it might not be as well known, across the continent. But it certainly is well known among those Africans who have gone to Russia. Very few of them want to stay in Russia afterwards. So I think it's a big problem for them, particularly if they do want to cultivate that next generation and sort of increase knowledge of Russian culture on the continent, as well as try to pique Russians' interests in Africa. Most Russians, are more interested in China or in Europe than they are in Africa, or even in the Middle East. I would argue, and I think racism certainly plays into that.
Yes, certainly. And when we analyze Russian media today, we see that there's a story, a third path, again, being developed in terms of race as well. So Russia does not want to agree with the U.S. Situation currently and with the outlooks, and it's trying to find a way to work around that. So we will see where that will lead us. Now, there's a comment here regarding and I've been trying to avoid China desperately. As a China scholar, you know, every second word that comes to mind is a link with China. But I've been trying to distance myself from that today. And yet our viewers have dragged us back into the Russia-China topic. And here's a comment. Maybe I will ask Alex, because you said you didn't want to talk about COVID. You didn't want to talk about vaccines that much. You just had the one slide. And this is about using vaccines strategically for elites to secure future favors. Our viewer writes, Russia and China are sending limited amounts of vaccines to several African states, just enough to vaccinate the leading elites and decision makers. So guess who will get the next contracts around certain resources? And the West is battling itself about who gets vaccinated first. So, Alex, is there really such behavior?
So there is the politics of generosity that's going on around vaccines and vaccine access. And it is completely correct that China in particular, but also Russia, have been sending small shipments to provide inoculation for elites. So and a number of those elites, you can see that the number one person who is inoculated, gets the jab, is the president or prime minister. So think Guinea, think Equatorial Guinea. You do have the West working in a different way, and India also providing shipments too. So let's not just box in China and Russia. So through Indian production of AstraZeneca, there have been shipments delivered to Mauritius, for example, that is more broad than the Prime Minister there. And also there have been deliveries to Ghana, for example, facilitated, which has been being rolled out. But it is a tool for kind of elite entrenchment. And I think that's where particularly Russia and China are playing in the short term a similar sort of game, which is different from India and the West, where it isn't about just providing for a narrow elite, but is trying to broaden and support the concept of universal health coverage.
Thank you. Now another question from our audience, and that has to do with something that Paul spoke extensively about, namely about the Soviet heritage, and also Alex mentioned about the Soviet heritage of the Russo-African exchanges. It seems that Russia is spearheading their strategic aims in the same way as the Soviets, with the Soviet aim being to sell arms and keep friendly leaders in power for the larger strategic aim regarding the West, so counterbalance to the West. How much of a threat is that to Western interests today? How would you assess it? Is it a fair assessment?
I mean, I think it is. It is a fair assessment in that they are, they're certainly cultivating senior leaders. They are cultivating authoritarian style leaders, and they also, come to the African continent with this sort of policy of non-intervention. Don't talk about what we do, and so they are able to sort of cultivate. And have sort of footprints similar, in the ways that the Soviets did. They have an ideological narrative, an increasingly ideological narrative, like the Soviets. The Soviets was, communism, socialism. Now it's sort of almost anti-Westernism, an alternative sense, or alternative ways of governance. But I think the problem for Russia, and I think Sudan is a very good example. Russia does not look at these countries as places that have agency of their own. So they will look and they will invest in a specific elite. But sometimes populations. And sometimes NGOs and sometimes journalists have different ideas. And so you see in Sudan, you saw with the collapse of the Zuma government in South Africa that Russia's bet on specific governments, specific individuals in that governments, isn't necessarily always guaranteed. And I think this is something where I think when sort of we in the West sort of engage in Africa. I think we are trying to engage more with broader institutions in Africa, which I think is a longer term, more effective strategy because, people go, governments go, people die, people get overthrown, and people get voted out of office. And so I think sort of that broader institutional engagement, I think it is a more effective in the long term. Russia might have short term gains, but whether the long term will pan out is not quite clear.
So obviously ideology matters, but not as quite as economy. And I also have just to follow up a quote here from Yevgeny Karendyasov, who used to be a Soviet, and here again a link with the sort of Soviet heritage with Russia today, Soviet and then Russian ambassador to Burkina Faso and Mali. And he outwardly speaks about the economic rationale of the Russian interests. And bear with me, I'm just translating this from Russian as we speak. So basically, of course, in Russia, we have everything. But of course, when it comes to several metals, we already are living in deficit. And our deficit is around 60–80%. And obviously, obtaining these materials in Africa are way cheaper. So we see aluminum monopoly is getting, Rusal is getting 60% out of bauxites right now from Guinea, and Severstal, Lukoil are all working there. And right now we see that around $5 to $8 billion the Russians have already they have invested to get more access to resources. And then this very unsettling last phrase: the opportunity is lost for Russia as a result of the fall of the Gaddafi regime are about $7 to $8 billion. So the fall of the Gaddafi regime is, in terms of economy in Russia, considered to be a loss of $8 billion. Now, I have a quite a provoking comment here. Hasn't Russia, and this will be to you, Paul, given your U.S. background, hasn't Russia just learned from the U.S. and others about delegating military functions to arm's-length companies, obviously meaning Wagner here, right, the one you spoke about, and for the same purposes, including domestic unpopularity of wars of choice? What's your comment here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen this sort of global shift away from private, away from official militaries towards private mercenary groups, private military contractors. I do think there is a slight difference here. First is that the United States has signed as most Western countries have signed the Montreux document, which actually is a standard of sort of action, a standard of sort of moral action of how these companies are supposed to engage, and Russia has never done that. Russia actually, by Russian law, these organizations are illegal. So Russia and the Russian law and several attempts to change that, Russia has never done that. So there's no regulation of them. There is regulation in South Africa of these organizations. There's regulation in the United States, and they are held accountable, when they overstep, which sometimes they do. And also in West, according to sort of international agreements on regulating private mercenary groups, they are supposed to be in a supportive role with the militaries the official militaries in primary roles. So you'll see American private military companies. They'll be in training. They'll be in logistics. They'll be doing those types of things in Afghanistan. Whereas in the Central African Republic, you have Russian fighters actually fighting, and they're not regulated, and many of them have ties to criminal elements, which I don't think you sort of see with some of these Western similar type organizations.
Now, just to quickly follow up and to bring back the security angle that we just addressed into the realm of disinformation, there are opinions among Russian politicians and also some think tankers that, in fact, the goal of Russian disinformation in African countries and beyond is to basically keep the population's buy-in with a central control, to safeguard stability of an elected regime and to make sure that the militant groups do not so kind of the population is in support of the leader they put their vote behind in the first place. And when we read Putin, he says that yes, Russian intelligence services should cooperate with African countries to fight, terrorism, extremism, transnational ideology, and piracy. Talking, of course, about extremism. So the idea of Russian military fighting jihadist extremists in Mozambique is oftenly mentioned here. How valid is that argument that, in fact, the Russian information manipulation is helping the stability of these countries? To you, Paul.
I mean, I think Alex might be a better person to answer this. I'm not so sure it does. I mean, we are, places where Russia has been active, particularly on sort of in information operations, also in their security footprint. The Central African Republic, Mozambique, Libya, they really haven't brought stability for the people of those countries. And so, I'm not so sure that it always pays off. This is certainly something that the Russians will sell and use in their propaganda and use to justify. I'm not sure that that's the reality, but I'd also defer. It'd be interesting to see what Alex has to say about that.
Question cut out for you, Alex, here from our audiences. That is why I just referred to Paul, but I would love to hear what you have to say on the subject, and then I will address you with the last question that we have today.
Okay, so I think Paul is right that mostly the Russian meddling in elections and using social media hasn't been particularly effective. Having said that, I do think that the Russian forensic attention on the referendum and elections in Guinea did play a role. And that's because, as you already mentioned, that Guinea is so strategic to Russia through Rusal. 60% of the world's bauxite comes from there. So that is a good example of a country that Russia understands the local politics extremely well, better than the West in many ways. And so intervened in the end to encourage the change of a constitution to allow for a third term for an incumbent president to stay on, because that's in the interests aligned with Rusal and the Russian Federation. But they were very effective in that, I think, and deployed some very well-class individuals who know what they're doing. So my takeaway point from this is don't just assume that the Russians are amateurish in Africa. They are not. They can be very effective, but it depends on the context and where they have experience. And in Guinea, they have decades of experience.
Excellent point. Now, please keep your mic on because I have another question from you. And that is geared towards the future, and that is indeed a very good way to finish our conversation or move towards the end of our conversation today. What opportunities exist in the future, particularly for the West, in these countries that we analyze today? And how much will countries like UK reducing aid budget and support add to the Russian narrative? Alex, I would love to start with you, but if Paul wants to jump in later, that would be wonderful. Please.
So, declined European Western interest in Africa opened up niches and opportunities. I think Central African Republic and why the Russians went in there is a good example of that. And at the time, everybody thought, well, that's just something that the Russians will greatly regret. We'll see. It's too early to conclude on that. But you're right. The challenges in Africa, when you're dealing with a continent of 54, maybe 55 countries, means there's challenges and opportunities and room for everybody, in fact. And most African countries actually want a multipolar world, and they want choice, and they have their own agency. And so they will choose a bit of Russia as well as a bit of the United States, as well as a bit of the EU, as well as a bit of the UK, China, India, and others. And it goes back to where countries are good at managing those relationships and extracting developmental value for them. That's a good thing, including from Russia. So it should not be zero sum. It shouldn't just be East or West. That's the future that could actually be very good for Africa if its leaderships manage this sort of world for the advantageousness of their populations to lift them out of poverty and get proper inclusive economic growth.
So essentially it boils down to resilient local institutions then, and local transparency.
Well, and true developmental vision, not just elite capture and accumulation. Given that Africa is the youngest continent in the world, and one of the overarching primary challenge for the continent is to create meaningful jobs, and so you need leadership to be able to do that, and multipolarity can help that, but you need that focus, and that's where I think Russia will need to up its game, because at the moment it's mostly about elite protection and extraction, and that's not a sustainable policy.
Thank you. Excellent points. Now, Paul, do you have any last comments before I proceed with the outro of today's incredibly informative conversation?
Sure. I just sort of, do want to second Alex's comments. I mean, I think, Russia does, it's playing a game of for the status quo. And I'm not sure the status quo is sustainable in Africa, given sort of the population growth, given the needs that the continent has. I also think we need to sort of look at the continent as not just Africa, but there's multiple different parts of Africa and multiple different needs in Africa. And I think tailoring our approach towards individual parts of Africa, individual countries of Africa, cultivating countries that are more democratic, where we have greater inroads, and working on places where that need greater human security. And I think these are areas, we can have a sort of more textured and nuanced approach towards Africa. I think, refocusing some attention on Africa. I think the United States in the last several years, particularly under the previous administration, alienated a lot of Africa. And I think, there's now new opportunities to re-engage. And I hope that particularly on the U.S. side, we will begin to do that. I would also just want to follow him in also reiterating the importance of sort of not making this seeing this only through the lens of geopolitical competition. I think that does not solve the needs of African and African people. And I think, it's creating a false choice, for governments in the region.
Thank you. I would like to thank our excellent speakers today, and the points that were made, I think, will ring back, and this is just the beginning of the conversation. So I would like to say that the center, NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence, has actually published a report named Russia's Activities in Africa's Information Environment and the Case Studies of Mali and Central African Republic, so you're welcome to check that out. And also, I would like to invite you to join us next week for a conversation on countering violent extremism in North Africa and the Sahel. Thank you.